Hello, friends, and we're returning to the definition of key terms related to the study of comparative politics. And this is week 2, lecture 1. And as we discussed in our previous lecture, the goals of comparative politics is to make comparisons, and the second is to learn how political systems in the world operate. And so we looked at what are the main areas or subjects of the study of comparative politics. Number one, institutions. Politics and government are most easily seen, observed, studied, critiqued through institutions. Institutions are the basics, the basic building block of our analysis. And different countries have different institutions. And those institutions can vary in the way they function tremendously. Usually in a democracy, for example, we talk about the legislative, the Congress or the Parliament, the executive, the president, the prime minister, and some judicial system, typically with a supreme court of some variety. Other political systems have different kinds of institutions, and that's why comparison and analysis is so important. Second element we look at is political behavior. And we look at all the different levels. At the base level, the average citizen, the elites, and then those are in power. Look at how they make decisions, how they carry out those decisions, and how they change over time. And then we look, just as a reminder, towards policy. What does the actual government do, and how does it carry out its functions? Okay, so as a kind of fundamental consideration, comparative politics is looking at what really happens in a country or a series of countries. We look at actually how those countries function, and we look at it from a comparative perspective, including all countries that can be studied. Well, let's talk about how they operate and how they behave. We look at the structures and see how they function, including different forms of democracy, various forms of authoritarian and totalitarian governments. Most countries in the world are not like the United States. They have different forms. We look at how countries interact with their own populations. Some countries tend to be perhaps more purely popular in a democratic sense than the United States, which might surprise some of us. Others, the citizens have very little say and very little involvement, and that is a subject for our study. And then lastly, as we've already begun to discuss, we look at political behavior. Okay, let's talk about government function and government itself, and what are the key components of studying comparative politics in terms of government function. Well, what do governments do in a comparative perspective? Most political scientists who study comparative politics look at 4 main areas, or 4 general categories of government function. The first is rulemaking. Governments create laws, constitutions that define what is legal, what is not legal, what is in the best interest of the country, and what really shouldn't be done. These are very important acts because they sort of set the ground rules for that political system and really attempt to dictate political life in that country. The second type of government function is what we call rule execution. Is look at what kind of impact a decision might make or might not make. For example, a few years ago in Saudi Arabia, where women were prohibited from driving, the right to drive vehicles under very specific restrictions was given to women. And this was dramatic. We celebrated this in the West and some openness in Saudi Arabia, and it was something that was a very popular move in the eyes of us in the West. Saudi Arabia, it took a long time for them to make that decision. We don't really know, in terms of rule execution, what that's meant for Driver safety, if anything, it may have increased even. What's that meant for opening up the role of women in other aspects of Saudi society? We really don't know, but if you see the pictures of the leadership, they're all men. Although there have been some recent decisions that are rulemaking to allow women to have more of a role in the political system. And so maybe this driving, maybe this greater social interaction might have been the basis. It may not have. Okay, third area, rule adjudicating. This is the process of determining if laws are really in the best interest of the people, or as we say in comparative politics, are they legitimate? Are they designed to benefit the citizenry of the country? Do the laws apply to everyone equally? If they don't, if there are issues in this regard, the country may find the decision about the fairness of a law being resolved in the judicial system of that country. But there are many other things besides those four issues that are part of government function. Governments have to maintain stable leadership if they want the country to survive. So there has to be a recruitment of future leaders. There has to be the retention of those leaders where there is an environment that encourages people to serve in government in various capacities. There has to be a desire to protect the natural resources of a country and to really inculcate the ideas, the morals, the Constitution to the rising generation. And by that I mean to young people. And so that's a very important role is political socialization. It's done different ways in different countries, different degrees of intensity, and that's a very exciting area for study. Well, let's talk about government and authority. Authority is the tool that government uses to carry out its function. By authority, we are attempting to define it as the legitimate power, just as most people believe that the rightful power of parents to discipline or to guide and to mentor their children is a very natural and appropriate power. When we create a government, especially in a democratic sense, we invest that government with power to function, power to carry out its role. And it is that authority that political regimes, that governments carry out. They also set rules for how that power is to be exercised, and it's different in different countries. One way of executing power and authority is through constitutions. They are individualized and institutionalized set of rules for a country. All constitutions aren't the same. It is the government and the democracy, the people and the government that set the rules for any particular country. Now, the change in the dynamic there is that many times governments change. Therefore, the whole apparatus of authority, all the rulemaking, and the Constitution itself changes. If you look at a country that has gone through tremendous turmoil, an overthrow of some kind of regime, let's say in Iran, or in 1979, or in Afghanistan, or Iraq, the Constitution itself becomes very different, and the role of the citizen can also become very different. So these things are flux. This is what makes studying politics so fascinating, is because governments change sometimes for a variety of reasons. Constitutions change. The obligations of the citizens change. Therefore, the whole dynamic of political authority changes as well. Is that every country has some type of government that we might call authoritative, we might call its central governing feature. Well, we must ask then a follow-up question. Why do people obey the law? Why do we obey the law of the United States? What makes the law so important? The law, of course, has different functions in different countries, and we'll talk more about that later in the semester. But some of the reasons people follow law is that if you don't follow the law, you may get in trouble. Fear or coercion. Very often, governments, not typically democracies, use fear and coercion to make people follow the law. For example, in the 1980s, when Germany was divided into East and West, East was communist. Post-World War II, West was democratic. I traveled to East Germany under the as part of the United States official delegation, and I was surprised that in East Germany, where there were once beautiful cities, much activity, at night there was no one on the street. And so I asked some of my West German friends who had traveled with me to East Germany, some of my colleagues, and they said, well, basically the lights go out at 8 o'clock. There are no clubs, and there are no places to go. In fact, if you're out on the street, you can be arrested. So the state, the government of East Germany exerted its power by prohibiting people being out at night. It set rules, and there's many, many examples of this. And this has also been the case in Latin America and other parts of the world. There are problems with using coercion against the citizens. And there are many aspects of this. One is it's expensive. Police are not cheap. A police force is not cheap. Gathering intelligence, information on one's own citizens is not cheap. Also, it greatly diminishes trust in the government's authority itself, because somebody's got to carry that out. It's going to be the police. Also, second of all, political socialization and education. Convincing people that obeying the government is the right thing to do refers to teaching them this in a class or in some kind of setting. Many times, authoritarian or totalitarian governments write their own history. For example, in a somewhat humorous vein, North Korea and its cult of personality and its totalitarian government makes its leaders, who are all related, to be unbelievably successful and unbelievable athletes, all of which is not true, but just to encourage faith and attraction to the leader of the country. Another reason that people obey is for security. I support the government supports me, which is kind of a fundamental issue of citizenship. If I obey the government, then the government will protect me. Another reason people obey government is for religious reasons, that God, the divine right kings in the Middle Ages, God put the king in power, therefore I am to follow and to obey the king. Even today, religion has a factor. In all political systems, religion is a factor. It's the right thing to do based upon that religion, perhaps. There are also certain laws that must be obeyed. There are political traditions that say follow the state, obey the state. Another reason we obey, especially in democracy, is we have elections. You may not like the president in a democracy, or you may not like your senator or your member of Congress, but because they were rightly elected, they're entitled to represent our views. They're entitled to be our representative. Sometimes other factors come into play: knowledge or age, the charismatic power of the leader himself or herself, which is very important, very attractive. This happens even in democracy, this idea of charismatic power. Okay, this is going to end week 2, lecture 1, and we're going to pick up on some other terms in our next lecture. Thank you very much.